So there are a lot of challenges, right, that exist for a stadium because it's not just the stadium itself. Like with the Super Bowl, there's fan zones, there's the different hotel corridors, there's different hubs where people are staying, the teams are staying, lead up events to the event itself, right, with people outdoors. And in a very similar fashion, that's what's going to happen with FIFA.
You're listening to the Drone Radio Show podcast, the show about drones and the people who use them for business, fun, and research. Hosted by Randy Goers.
Hello, everyone. This is Randy Goers, and welcome to the Drone Radio Show podcast, episode 451. Are we prepared to move beyond drone detection to true airspace intelligence? To explore that question, we head to Charlotte, North Carolina, to speak with Melissa Swisher, Chief Revenue Officer at SkySafe, a company delivering the intelligence organizations need to detect, analyze, and act in today's increasingly complex airspace environment. SkySafe specializes in airspace intelligence, providing real-time drone detection, analytics, and forensic capabilities that help organizations determine whether a drone is authorized, where it originated, how it's flying, and in some cases, who is operating it. The company works with state agencies, public safety organizations, and major event operators to bring greater visibility and accountability to the skies above critical infrastructure and large public gatherings. As Chief Revenue Officer, Melissa leads SkySafe's strategic partnerships and revenue growth initiatives, helping expand the company's footprint across government and commercial markets. She brings extensive C-level experience, having played key roles in two successful IPOs, SuccessFactors and Castlight Health, as well as multiple strategic acquisitions. Prior to SkySafe, she co-founded Socrates.ai, which was recently acquired by Simpplr. Known for building high-performing teams and driving customer-focused growth, Melissa combines operational expertise with a deep understanding of scaling emerging technologies. In this episode of the Drone Radio Show, Melissa discusses the evolution of airspace intelligence, the biggest gaps in current drone defense systems, what new legislation means for local law enforcement, and how organizations are preparing for large-scale global events in an era of rapidly expanding drone activity. Before we hear from Melissa, I want to say that your support is the heartbeat of this podcast. Every episode is crafted with you in mind, and your generous donations help cover production costs and keep the show going. Whether it's the price of a cup of coffee or a larger contribution, every bit helps. To donate, visit droneradioshow.com/donate. And if you can, please subscribe to the podcast on your favorite platform and leave a review. It really helps the show stand out among the thousands of podcasts out there. And if you have a great story about how drones are being used, I'd love to hear from you. You can reach me at randy@droneradioshow.com. So let's learn how organizations are moving beyond simple drone detection to real-time airspace intelligence with Melissa Swisher of SkySafe. Let's pick up the interview where I ask Melissa to introduce herself.
My name is Melissa Swisher, and I am the Chief Revenue Officer at SkySafe. My job is to scale how we bring airspace intelligence to public safety and to the critical infrastructure world by working with both federal, state, local agencies, stadiums, event operators in terms of the work that we do every day.
Melissa, tell us about SkySafe. What does the company do?
SkySafe provides airspace intelligence, right? And so the best way to think about that is, what airspace intelligence means to us is that's the ability to detect drone activity, understand what is actually happening, right? When we think about in the air itself, especially related to the low altitude airspace, and then how do we support operator attribution and investigations? So, our mission is essentially to help these organizations and the government operate safely in a world where drones are everywhere.
There are a lot of companies providing similar airspace intelligence services. In your view, What makes SkySafe stand out in that space?
The way that we think about how we essentially operate differently within this space, right, is that we don't just spot a drone. Not only are we going to show, somebody what a drone is with that make and model and the information related to that, we also have the ability where we actually help agencies prove what happened by connecting that, drone incident to other flight records. And then how do we integrate that intelligence into actual operational workflows, right? So when you think about it, it's not only showing that drone detection in a point in time, but it's also giving those patterns over time. Let's to say if it's over a different type of airspace, if there's continued activity related to that drone. And then how do we look at that over the historical capacity as well?
Can you share examples of how SkySafe has worked with organizations, such as state agencies or major event operators, to enhance drone safety and security?
Absolutely. So I could give you a couple different examples, right? And so if we're starting with an agency in particular, Rhode Island Emergency Management Agency, obviously is in Rhode Island. They've been a customer for ours for just a little over 2 years. Last year alone, we've logged over 30,000 different drone flights, right? Which has actually helped them demonstrate the scale of activity and support, you know, the work they're doing, making sure all of these different items are safe and sound. In another case, University of Illinois has been a customer for a while. They see an array of drone traffic, right? Because not only do people use drones, especially over colleges, right? They've seen over 500 drone flights in a month around campuses. There was a time during a football game, campus police used SkySafe to track an unauthorized operator about a half a mile away within minutes, which actually led to an arrest because it included the forensic evidence related to that drone in terms of those flight records and the geolocation information.
With tens of thousands of drone flights logged across deployments, what trends or surprising patterns are emerging in drone behavior?
With the volume of flights that are logged, there are some patterns, right? The first thing is that a couple of patterns that can show up consistently, right? One, volume is absolutely higher than most people actually anticipate. And oftentimes it's concentrated in predictable places like campuses, stadiums, and dense corridors. A lot of the other piece, though, is activity is recreational or negligent, but a smaller slice is really around this repeat behavior, right? Where we're seeing those drones pop up in terms of similar locations and timing patterns, which is exactly why that historical context matters. When you start to look across the portfolio of our customer, what you start to actually see is these airspace routines, right? And that's really, how do we just shift that notion from detection to intelligence? So understanding what's actually normal, right, in terms of the day-to-day activity that happens with drones, what's not, and what actually requires a response. The surprise itself is rarely the drone. It's really, how often it happens and how hard it is to actually respond without having those details behind it.
When you identify repeatable patterns, are you able to determine whether it's a specific drone or operator returning? Or are multiple drones simply following similar behavioral patterns?
The thing that's really surprising is you will see patterns of a couple of things, right? There's all the patterns of the friendly flights that we know exist, right? Because so take for example, like a farm, right? They'll do like potentially agricultural drones to go over and survey property, right? Those happen on a consistent basis. The things that in terms of the surprising piece around the trends or what I would say about it's not necessarily, oftentimes it is a specific drone that's using it for recon, right? So for example, let's say it was like a critical infrastructure or a substation. Let's say one of those locations is in Greensboro, North Carolina. Then that same drone pops up at another power substation in Atlanta, Georgia, right? Those are the things that give the ability of the breadth, right? Especially if it's within that same energy company where you can start to detect those patterns, right? And why it's so important to be able to see across that nationwide airspace for whatever those particular drones may or may not be doing.
Is the intelligence data limited to SkySafe system? Or is there any ability to cross-reference information with other airspace intelligence providers?
I think that's the challenge. Without a solution like SkySafe, that's really fragmented today because, agencies and tools aren't necessarily connected, so nobody has the complete picture. And so this is a place where a system like SkySafe comes in, right? Because that is a place where it is a persistent across the entire nation where we can show those patterns. Those are the biggest gaps that exist because just because, for instance, you can detect something, knowing a drone is present isn't the same as knowing who's responsible. And then to compound that, one of the things is there are limitations to local authority, right? Many local agencies can't do anything about a drone, so they can't mitigate it. So they need the intelligence that supports an investigation, that coordination and prosecution, right? Right now, the only group who can act in terms of doing something to mitigate a drone is within the federal government. Now, there's some nuances that are coming down the pike with the FIFA World Cup, but the reality is it's all about making sure you have that intel and historical context in order to do something.
Based on your experience working with stadium operators and federal, state, and local government leaders, what are the biggest gaps in existing drone defense systems?
So there are a lot of challenges, right, that exist for a stadium because it's not just the stadium itself, right? You start to think about, so you mentioned the Super Bowl and we're on the heels of FIFA. So let's take the FIFA World Cup, for example, as a prime site. And the Super Bowl plays in many angles to the same concepts because it's not the stadium itself. Like with the Super Bowl, there's fan zones, there's the different hotel corridors, there's different hubs where people are staying, the teams are staying, lead up events to the event itself, right, with people outdoors. And in a very similar fashion, that's what's going to happen with FIFA. That challenge isn't the footprint isn't just the stadium itself, it's the training facilities. In many cases, like we can take Boston, for example, where the event itself will be at Gillette Stadium, right, in Foxborough. But where those teams are staying are in Providence. And then they have fan sites, which are going to be spread across not only different towns and locations in Massachusetts, but that is also going to spill into Rhode Island. And then the practice facilities where teams are going to play, in that case, I think are happening at Bentley University, a private university in Rhode Island. So all of a sudden now it is multiple, like you have to be able to go across jurisdiction, right? You got to go across law enforcement agencies. Like in that example itself, there's the Boston PD, there's Foxborough, there's Massachusetts State PD, there's Rhode Island, there's Rhode Island Emergency Management. So you have to figure out how we can align that across all of those different operators, right? You have to align how you're looking at how those incidents get handled, who will get alerted, who's going to actually verify it, and then who documents and how that information flows into an overall command center. For major events like the FIFA event coming up across all these different cities or the Super Bowl, the biggest risk is having drone intelligence sit in a silo instead of it being integrated into a broader security protocol and picture.
How does SkySafe work with a variety of jurisdictional entities to ensure data is being shared to the right people at the right time?
In many cases, we'll coordinate that across. Like in the instance of FIFA, one of the things we're doing is for every local agency who's going to leverage us, whether that is on the west coast of the country, the middle part of the country, or the east part of the country, they will have access to, given permission, everybody will have same access to levels of like the protocols that they need. So for example, if a drone incursion happened in one of those particular cities and then it was in another, they'll be able to see those patterns, right? Which will be very helpful. And, the thing that these guys are doing really well, what you're seeing is a lot of these local law enforcement agencies collaborate collectively to share that visibility across that airspace, right? So that just is like a natural thing that these guys are doing, through a platform like SkySafe to enable that. So if there is an alert that people should be aware of, they will be notified, right? And so it's all about giving that visibility and collaboration that's really going to be able to help make this a really safe and risk-averse event.
Can you give us a status of the counter-drone preparations for FIFA? What's currently happening?
There was quite a bit of federal funding, $250 million that was allocated to different state and local federal agencies across the country to be used for CUAS measures. And those measures include being able to do things in terms of detection, right? And that detection comes across some of the things like SkySafe does, which is RF detection. There's radar, there's electro-optical, and then there's acoustic and mitigation. And so what those guys have been doing, they all applied for different levels of funding. the state agencies have now received that funding. And so one of the things that is happening now is all of those different agencies are talking to all of the vendors within the space to set up, and to figure out who is that right provider. So in the case of SkySafe, I can't talk about the folks we've already contracted with, but with the event starting right around the corner as we approach June, many of these agencies are in the process right now of working through and collaborating with these providers to support these agencies.
What investments, whether in technology, training, coordination, or policy, are most needed to support enhanced drone security for FIFA events?
So in the case of SkySafe itself, one of the things is we have, if you're familiar with cell towers, SkySafe works and operates in a pretty similar model, except the difference is that we have equipment, sensors that basically are stood up in different parts of geographical regions and cities, right, that will actually then provide that detection. We don't always disclose where we actually put our towers and sensors, right? But what the intent is that hardware is set up. SkySafe takes on all the heavy lift of doing that. In the case of when we're starting to beef up like a particular area, so for example, with an event like FIFA, there's going to be lots of different signals in the air, and so what we'll do is we'll create redundancy. So information in terms of detection will be, essentially flawless, right? And then everything from a command center point of view is operated out of the software application that those local law agencies will have. So in that instance, for example, there's nothing really for them to do. We set up those locations, alert zones that will happen. And so anytime a drone would fall within that alert zone that they have, the people will get an automatic alert with where the drone operator's position is, where the home position of the drone is, and the flight path it's going. Right. So giving and texting those direct coordinates to that officer so they can go and investigate quickly in real time is extremely helpful for avoiding any sort of potential challenging situations and circumstances.
When infrastructure is deployed for a major event, does that investment remain with the local community afterward? Or is it typically temporary and removed after the event?
Oftentimes what you'll see these agencies do is they'll use it for multiple years, right, with this funding, to stand that up, or maybe at least 1 to 2 years. And then oftentimes there will, at least next year, the second part of the Safer Skies Act, right, is a additional incremental $250 million for the following year. So what you're going to see is these drones are going to be continued to use for both like really good things, as well as you're going to see the rise of things that aren't as ideal, right? And the trick here is that it's just like as the technology evolves, right, the tools and solutions that the police and law agencies will have at their fingertips is going to evolve with it. So I think that is something that will be continued to be funded. If I look back at my iPhone from when I first got an iPhone or a cell phone to today, those are vastly different concepts. The same concept is going to apply when it comes to drones and drone technology and how we're going to continue to evolve with it. And then the needs and demands will start to change, and SkySafe will evolve with those needs and demands to meet that as well.
What does new legislation, such as the Safer Skies Act, mean for local law enforcement's ability to respond to drone incursions?
Historically, mitigation authority, so when you think about mitigation, think of things like jamming a drone, intercepting a drone, or disabling a drone. That's largely been limited to certain federal agencies, and that has to be under certain conditions. Most local police departments today can respond, they can investigate, they can coordinate, and they can build cases, but they generally cannot take down a drone on their own without specific legal authority. Now, with the Safer Skies Act, it is important because it's designed to expand that counter UAS authority to state, local, tribal, and territorial law enforcement and correctional agencies. But like anything else, it has guardrails, right? So some of the things that exist, that there's training and certification that will need to happen and be mandated in order to use those approved technologies. And it requires strict reporting and oversight requirements. So in practicality, it's a path towards more local capability, but it's not a free-for-all, right? The implementation of this, the certification of this, and the coordination of this will matter.
You mentioned that it's not just stadiums that need to be monitored, but there are ancillary facilities, like training facilities, fan zones, and transportation hubs. Could you expand a bit further on that?
To your point, it's vast. It's not the stadium itself. It's the training facilities and all the other moving parts you mentioned. So, you have to align how these incidents get handled operationally. Like who will get alerted, who's going to verify it, who's going to document it, and how that information flows within the command center. For these major events, the biggest risk is having that drone intelligence like sit there, like I said, I think earlier, just alone, right? Instead of being brought into that integrated, broader security picture.
Inside the command center, what does the operator actually see on the screen? What kind of information is presented in real time?
It is it's a huge command center if you picture it correctly, right? And it's got to have that whole integration, how that operationally is integrated, right? So where that is often is the real-time crime center, command center, alongside with CAD, the cameras, and dispatch. And so when you think about it, like having that single pane of glass matters, right? So that's why the integration. So we work very closely. Motorola Solutions is a strategic alliance of ours. They offer products that called Command Central Aware, right? Which integrates all of those different entities because what it does is it puts that regardless of that system, it puts that drone intelligence in the same system that people are already using and looking at for full, complete airspace picture and visibility.
Is there a distinction between a drone that is airborne versus one that is powered on but still on the ground?
When it comes to something like a SkySafe, it's not going to necessarily see one on the ground per se. It tracks it during when it's in flight. Now, that being said, like if you have a drone first responder program which gets launched, so oftentimes what will happen is, let's say there was something identified in the sky, like a drone, and you want to launch a drone as a first responder, that can all be teed up through that single pane of glass kind of experience. So that gives them that complete picture.
If someone powers on a drone in a restricted area but hasn't taken off yet, would that activity register? Or does the drone need to be airborne to trigger detection?
No, it will actually, because oftentimes what you'll see is that operator position is often different than the position of where that drone is, right? So it'll track that entire movement in terms of where that drone is going.
Are you able to triangulate or identify the operator's location as well as the drone itself?
Yes, operator, home position, and drone pattern. That's right. Flight paths. Altitude, and it'll be able to tell you different altitudes, and there's all sorts of airspace thresholds that'll automatically flag based on FAA guidelines as well.
From the console operator's perspective, what are they truly looking for? Since many drones are legally operating, what indicators signal that something requires attention?
Where SkySafe comes in is we actually can create those parameters for them so they don't have to stare at the screen all the time, right? So think of it this way. Let's say you wanted to have some sort of perimeter that was, X number of kilometers that was outside of the place you were concerned about protecting. What SkySafe does is we set up geofence, right? A geofence, and that will create alert zones. So let's say anytime a drone goes into that airspace, it can automatically trigger an alert. And that alert can come in through a text message, that could come in through a Slack message, or it could come right on the screen if somebody's looking at it, right? And then at that point, it'll come in, and then there could be a very good reason, right, why that drone came into that space. One, oops, it's somebody who's doing some recreational thing. They didn't recognize what they were doing, but it's worth us providing those coordinates on that particular drone to see what it, if somebody wants to go ahead and go investigate it further, right? With that alert, it'll provide the actual long and lat of where that operator is. And so then that's an opportunity to go have that conversation. So, and then also there's going to be, there's things that we pre-register, because oftentimes what you'll see is in terms of friendly drones, and those things will be oftentimes that will be a drone as a first responder program that a law enforcement agency will have. So that would be normal drones or drones that are doing surveillance, right? Things like that for good reasons, agriculture, things like that, or drone delivery services.
Is AI currently being used to analyze flight patterns and help differentiate intent based on behavioral indicators?
It's getting there, is what I would say. So the reality is, yes, it's already starting to do AI mechanisms to be able to support, patterns of life and trends and threat reporting and profiles. But you can also leverage, within SkySafe itself, like a chat component that can say, okay, what are these different drones we've seen fly between, X date and Y date, right? So just similar how you interface with any tool in everyday life and say, okay, are we starting to see them on more than 6 flights, right? So you have the ability to start using AI in a way that people are starting to use AI in their everyday life too, just in terms of getting to that information quickly. So in addition to that patterns of life and threat prediction, you're also seeing the ease of that experience to get to that information quickly.
What lessons have organizers learned about integrating airspace intelligence into broader event security planning?
I think the big thing is integrating that experience early is really key, right? The ability to get ahead of things in terms of when you're starting to have a major event, I think is just key in terms of, being prepared for that in terms of, what is ahead. So I think that that is the big piece in terms of about communicating, starting to plan out, and starting to have that integration across the board is really, really important.
At the local level, when new workflows are introduced into established law enforcement or security protocols, is there resistance or a learning curve in fully integrating them?
It has to be done within the planning phase and it shouldn't be added the week before. So you have to have that ability to start planning as soon as sooner than later and plan for it across the different types of entities that exist, right? So I think that requires coordination, not only in the system that you're using as that single pane of glass, that requires coordination across those agencies, that requires coordination around testing, right? And there's different operational pieces that come in. There's test flying, different types of drones. We do that, as we stand up coverage. We collaborate often with the local law enforcement to do those test flights leading up to it. We're starting to capture historical data leading up to it. So all of those things in terms of those planning to make sure that you're ready for when that event happens is important. You've got to test all sorts of, different types of conditions of environment, things like that. So I think it's really key for the ability to get that done.
Over the last several years, what have you learned about the evolution of drone detection and situational awareness?
It's been fascinating, right? I think that the future of airspace and the technology that exists, it's so bright, right? But it's got to be paired with that accountability. We're moving into a world where the low altitude airspace is just as important as the physical security on the ground. And so right now we are on the forefront if we continue to build that right intelligence and the workflows and policy guardrails related to drone use, right? Drones can scale safely and the communities can trust this without absorbing some of the more high profile risks.
What's next for SkySafe? What future developments should we be watching for?
I think for SkySafe, it's about scaling airspace intelligence, right? More persistent deployment, things about deeper operational integrations, and then how we think about expanding our forensics as a service, right? So giving information to agencies that they can close that loop from that actual incident to that accountability. When we think about what's next for SkySafe and how that parlays into airspace intelligence, the category, I think airspace intelligence becomes as standard as CCTV, right? So cities and critical infrastructure will want a low altitude map of everything that's happening. And how we provide that in terms of like looking about investigative patterns and hold operators accountable is key and is going to become a standard operating procedure. So it's interesting to see, right? Technology continues to evolve, those protocols evolve with it. So I think it's going to be an interesting for what's in store, so to speak.
As SkySafe scales, what challenges does the company face?
I think the ability to get world global coverage would be like something that would be a nirvana state. But right now we're really focused on nationwide national coverage. And so the way that you continue to enhance that is different types of technology, right? One of the things that we're doing is, right, we have, all sorts of different types of modalities that can be used, right? You start thinking about what's next in terms of, do you start to look at things like smaller sensor deployments that fill in these different pockets to ensure that there's no places of no coverage? Or you start to think of a future state, what could even look like, body worn drone detection, right? So how do you start to think about embedding that into, for example, things that might be in equipment already, right? And so that way that you're always getting that different view, right? And consistent view across because, as people travel on foot, they don't want to take a ton of equipment. And then being able to use that as a drone detecting device could be pretty interesting and certainly something that I think we think about for scale for the agencies and the government we serve. So, and then I think it's about the expansion of the footprint of what we detect because right now, just like everything, technology continues to evolve. And so while the RF of the DJIs and the different types of autels and different type of drones are out there, we're going to continue to see how we scale those expanded portfolio of library of the drones that we're actually detecting. That's always going to be an evolving profile for us because there's always going to be new drones that are introduced to the market. And so for us, that's like right now, I think we have over 6% detection rates and of all the drones in the sky. And so how does SkySafe continue to show that data and intelligence, which really, sets that standard? So I think if you couple those things about different types of modalities of types of sensors, you take it into account with the ability to really start to enhance that, detection and what we are detecting. I think that's how we continue to scale to give a best solution forward for our customers.
And for my final question, Melissa, what message would you like to leave about the future of the drone industry?
Again, I think it's really the future's bright, right? It's got to continue to be paired with that accountability. We're moving into this new world where that altitude and the airspace that's above us, that low altitude, it's just as important as that physical security of what is, what you can see in line of sight. And if we continue to build upon that right intelligence and the things that we want to do with guardrails and workflows, drones can absolutely scale safely. And, I think that this is the place where communities can trust that without having to absorb that risk.
That's it for episode 451 of the Drone Radio Show. I hope you enjoyed hearing from Melissa Swisher of SkySafe. I want to thank Melissa for taking the time to speak with me. If you want to learn more about SkySafe or want to connect with Melissa, visit SkySafe.io. If you enjoy the Drone Radio Show, please subscribe, share the podcast, and leave a review on your favorite platform. And if you're able to support the show, you can donate at droneradioshow.com/donate. Thanks for listening. Your support truly means a lot, and I hope you'll tune in to future episodes of the Drone Radio Show to hear how drones are being used for business, fun, and research. For the Drone Radio Show, I'm Randy Goers.
This has been the Drone Radio Show podcast. More information on today's show can be found on our website at www.droneradioshow.com. If you're using drone technology for business, fun, or research and would like to share your experience on the show, please visit our website and fill out a guest appearance application. And don't forget to follow us on your favorite social media channels.